My name is Ingrid Hansen. I'm president of the Southeast Asian Ceramic Society, and SEOX is very honored to be a joint organizer of Professor Adrian Vickers' talk this evening with ACM, From Majapahit to Bali, Genealogies of Indonesian Culture. Professor Vickers is from a small town in New South Wales. He's been interested in the vibrant culture of Indonesia since he traveled there as a 14-year-old student. He completed his BA and PhD in Indonesian and Malayan Studies at the University of Sydney, where he now holds a professorial chair in Southeast Asian Studies in the Faculty of Arts and is the director of the Asian Studies program. He teaches subjects on Southeast Asian history and culture from first year to honors and master's levels. His expertise in Indonesian language, Balinese, Kawi, which is Old and Middle Javanese, and Dutch has been instrumental in his research. He's held a series of Australian Research Council grants and has been in Singapore now for 3 months at the Asian Research Institute, or ARI, to complete a book on contemporary Indonesian history. Professor Vickers has created a virtual museum of Balinese painting as part of a linkage grant on the history of Balinese painting, and recently published Bali, A Paradise Created, A History of Modern Indonesia, and Balinese Art, Paintings, and Drawings of Bali, 1800 to 2010. His book on pearling in the zone between North Australia and Eastern Indonesia is in press. Professor Vickers consults to business and organizations on a wide range of Southeast Asian subjects, such as the viability of the oil industry in Myanmar and Australian-Indonesian relations. He has also supervised over 20 completed PhD theses. So let's welcome Professor Adrian Vickers to ACM.
Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you to ACM and also to the Asia Research Institute, who hosted me very nicely in Singapore. Yes, as Ingrid said, we were talking about potential research topics, and I said, well, I don't really have much to say about ceramics, but I have been doing some work on Majapahit and the history. Well, I've been looking at the rewriting of the history of Majapahit, and then Ingrid said, well, this would be perfect for the Singapore Ceramics Society. So I said, okay, let's talk about that. And maybe my subtitle, which I haven't reproduced here, is slightly misleading because I'm actually talking not just about Indonesian culture and its deeper history, but also Southeast Asian culture. And in the latter half of the lecture, I'll explain that a little bit more as I go. But first of all, my starting point is to explain the Hindu kingdom of Majapahit. Now, I think many of us living in Southeast Asia know the name, but there are also a lot of misconceptions about Majapahit, and to some degree, although the name is there in lights in Indonesian history, people don't know as much about Majapahit as they might about Angkor or Bagan, which are both quite large and spectacular archaeological sites. And that's possibly because Majapahit is, when you go there, a little bit more modest, as I'll talk about later. But just because it didn't leave a monument of the size of Angkor Wat doesn't necessarily mean that, excuse me, it's my bus ticket home, doesn't mean that Majapahit is any less important, and in some ways it's actually more important. Now my opening slide shows there the zodiac or sun symbol that's often associated with Majapahit, and this is perhaps the first element in what needs to be talked about, and that is the idea of the representation of the cosmos. This is a typical Hindu symbol showing the gods of the different directions, and each of the figures that you see corresponds to a Hindu god, and we'll return to that a little bit later. But in some other traditions, this might be a lotus, or it might be represented by other figurative elements, including zodiac kinds of elements. But in the Majapahit tradition, there's something quite distinctive about these sun symbols. So in current discussions about Majapahit, these are representative of Majapahit as a whole. Okay, this is not necessarily all that clear, but I'll just put up this map to show you vaguely where I'm talking about, which is East Java. We don't have a pointer, do we? I'll just use my fingers. Okay. So here is actually the location of the heartland of Majapahit, around a city called Trowulan, which is near Mojokerto, and it's a kind of minor, very minor place in the present-day geography of East Java, but reasonably close to the port city of Surabaya that you can see right next to Madura, and importantly on a river that the mouth of this river, called the Brantas, reaches the sea at Surabaya, but once upon a time the Brantas River was a major swiftly flowing river that you needed to have a ferry system to cross, and it was a river system that allowed you to carry goods, rice and other kinds of goods, from the hinterland of East Java, a very rich and fertile area fed by volcanoes, to the sea, where at these port cities, but also at the capital of Majapahit, you could actually exchange goods from the Spice Islands to the east, and right over, of course, via Singapore to India and Arabia, and ultimately Europe, and of course north to China. So Majapahit, like the other major cities of Southeast Asia and the other major kingdoms of Southeast Asia, was a maritime polity, and this, I think, is important for explaining it. And it's worth repeating that, because when you go to Java, you always get the impression that everything is focused inwards towards the land, whereas these kingdoms were always focused towards the sea. So it's not hard to remember that in Singapore. Sometimes you lose a bit of sight of that in Java, but the orientation towards the sea is quite significant, and the trading role in building up the power and wealth of Majapahit is also significant. So that by the time that the first Europeans arrived, there were already reports of Java as being the richest island on earth. That was one characterisation, and that Java was an island that far defeated some of the major European trading centres such as Venice and so on. So you have to think of what is certainly a glorious past, but then when you go to East Java, you see the mighty Brantas River is actually a rather polluted little trickle of a stream. So there is a bit of a disjunction between the past and the present. Now, all of the numbers here, correspond to major temples, and again a bit of a contrast to Angkor Wat, where you can find all of the major temples more or less in one place. You really have to go all over East Java to see the different sites of Majapahit, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. Okay, a little bit of background. Now, I think everybody's aware of Borobudur and the central Javanese kingdoms, so central Java over here, but there seems to have been a major shift in the history of Java around about the beginning of the 10th century, and we have this date 929, which signals a shift from the great kingdoms of central Java that built Borobudur and Prambanan to East Java, that for some reason, and The various theories give different accounts, whether it was a major volcanic eruption, as is probably the case, whether there were other ecological or trade elements that fed into this, we're not quite sure. But for some reason, around 929, all of the powerful people and their interest in Hindu Javanese and particularly Hindu Buddhist religion shifted their focus of power to East Java. And they began to erect a number of Hindu sacred bathing places, and following that to set up a number of different temples around an area called Kadiri, which is not too far from, it's a little bit to the west of where the capital of Majapahit, Trowulan, was. And the accounts vary quite a lot, but and we have just, in like a lot of ancient history, we have very vague information about the nature of the kingdom of Kadiri. It seems that there were a number of competitor kingdoms that coexisted with it, but certainly between 929 and 1222, the rulers of Kadiri left a number of inscriptions, and like other aspects of the ancient Southeast Asian past, it's through these inscriptions that we really know what happened. The highlight of the kingdom of Kadiri was the rule of King Airlanga, or Airlanga. He's had a university named after him, in another area called Jangala, which is actually just that area, we think, just that area directly south of Surabaya. And Airlanga as well was important because he was descended from both Javanese and Balinese royal families, and seemed to represent the fact that the Javanese kingdoms had not only established quite powerfully and were beginning to trade in Java itself, but that they were beginning to extend their influence outside of the island of Java eastward to Bali. Now, as with all of these dynasties, for those of you who know your Southeast Asian history, you always get founding kings who do exciting things, then their kids have major squabbles, they usually kill each other or something like that. So there's constant succession disputes and shifts that go on in the power balance. And while most people might look at Southeast Asian history as quite unstable, in fact, you have to think of it as quite flexible, as a number of different power centres coexisting and the power shifting from one to the other. You also have to think of Southeast Asian kingdoms as not necessarily being firmly rooted in one place, but actually shifting from time to time, and this might even be from generation to generation. The main palace will move from one site to another. So we're not talking about that European or ancient Roman idea of having a single palace that stays in the one place and the personnel change. We're really talking about a very mobile version of how power operates. And one of those shifts in power was to a site called Singasari, which is just north of the present-day city of Malang, and that occurred around 1222 and lasted not as long as some of these other dynasties. It was founded by a famous character called Ken Arok, whose main claim to fame before he became ruler was that he was a thief, but he managed to not only do in the last king of Kadiri, but also to marry his wife and thus acquire power through the female line, which is also quite important in terms of the role of women as representing power in, certainly in the East Javanese kingdoms. We have lots of accounts of powerful queens, and Majapahit is no exception in that. There was another period of instability around 1293, which seems to have been triggered off by an expedition from China, from the Mongols. And the Chinese entered into local politics and I guess, took sides in a dispute. And out of that shift in power, then a character called Raden Wijaya emerged to found a new kingdom. And like all of these Javanese stories and Balinese stories, you have mythical accounts of princes wandering around and finding some kind of sign. In his case, what he found was a maja tree. I don't have a photograph of what a maja tree looks like. It's a bale, I think, is the other name for it. The fruit of which was very bitter, pait. So Majapahit was the name of the kingdom. Not necessarily all that auspicious, but perhaps ironically intended to be the founding name of this great kingdom. I just included that. That's an example of a Singasari temple. When you go, the main temple of Singasari, Chandi Singasari, is on a very urban location, but if you go a little bit up to the hills in the jungle, you'll find all these little bits and pieces of temples, and we haven't really mapped all of the temples out. We don't really know much about them. So this is one where we have stones that people have put together in one shape, but all of the bits don't actually quite fit together. So we're not even sure if this partial reconstruction in a rounded form is a valid one or not. And I think this draws attention to the fact that we know certain amounts of things about the archaeology of East Java, but there is a lot more to be done, and I'm hoping that my colleagues who work on Angkor will be able to use some of their insights from their research. If we can find the right funding for the kinds of LiDAR and other aerial surveys to carry on, and that our colleague John Miksic will be able to do more research in East Java, since he's also done significant work there in the past. Okay, now Majapahit, we don't have a lot of archaeology. We have some inscriptions, and the picture of Majapahit is illuminated partly by later accounts. So particularly, not so much in the Javanese literature, but actually in literature from the Malay world, there are accounts of the power of Majapahit. But the chief element that we have for actually explaining Majapahit is a contemporary document, that is a poem written in the Kawi or Old Javanese language by a court poet to the ruler of Majapahit in the 14th century, and that survived in copied form through Bali and actually ended up in Lombok, in the royal palace of Lombok, when the Dutch defeated the king and sacked the palace at the end of the 19th century. And this manuscript, called the Negara Kertagama, which is the ordering of the state, I guess is one way to talk of it, according to religion, is also known as the Desa Warnana, the description of the districts or the parts of the realm. This text was studied by Dutch scholars who did a variety of analyses from it and produced the picture of Majapahit as a strong kingdom. Now, there's a question